welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout, where today we're going to be taking a look at how good have melee weapons been throughout the Fallout games as an attack style. And let's start this off with Fallout 1. So in Fallout 1, melee actually starts out fairly strong. There is going to be kind of a parallel here between melee and unarmed pretty much all the way through all the Fallout games. So I'm going to be comparing them to one another quite a bit, and that's simply because they function very similar to one another, but they are ultimately two different skills. This would kind of become just like one skill as the games went on in Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4. Yes, they are still separate skills, but so many of their perks that work for one or work for the other just kind of go hand in hand together. So keep that in mind. If you're building towards melee, you might be building towards unarmed or vice versa. In the first game, that wasn't really necessary because there wasn't really any perks that really benefited one or the other, with the exception of like Ninja at max level, but you might not even get up to there, or at level 18, it's not technically max level in Fallout 1, but most of the time when I've completed Fallout 1, I've completed the game at like level 15 to 16-ish, so I'm not even hitting the level 18 perks. With that being said, the first melee weapon that you're probably going to find in Fallout 1 was going to be the knife, because you started out with it, and you could get one immediately in Fallout 1 when you start right outside the vault. There was a skeleton there who had 10mm bullets, some stim packs, and a knife on them, and the knife was an okay weapon. It was very comparable to the brass knuckles that you start out with, because they did almost the same amount of damage. Brass knuckles were 2 to 5, the knife was 1 to 6. So you could potentially high roll with the knife and do a little bit more damage than the knuckles, but the knuckles were going to be more consistent because you could also low roll with the knife. This wasn't a major difference though, and picking between the two was really personal choice. They also required the same amount of action points, so it didn't really matter which one you were going for. Melee weapons, though, did require strength, as opposed to unarmed weapons, which only required 1 strength. So if you were going with unarmed, you actually didn't need that much. Although with both these, you were probably going to go with high strength because they scale better off of that, and some of their perks are related to it. So it was going to be pretty comparable to the start with melee and unarmed. There wasn't that much of a difference. In the mid-game, it was kind of going to be the same thing, where you might swap off your knife for like the crowbar, or the spear, or the sledgehammer, or something like that. And for unarmed, it would probably be like you'd swap off brass knuckles for spike knuckles. Again, these were extremely comparable weapons to one another. Once you got the combat knife, that was one of the better melee weapons that you could get in the early game of Fallout 1. And you were probably going to be using that up into the point where you could get your late game weapons. And for melee, your late game weapons were either the Ripper or the Super Sledge. The Super Sledge could do more damage per hit, and it could also take less action points to swing than the Ripper, which was kind of good. But it also had knockback on it, which could be potentially annoying to deal with, because if you wanted to hit an enemy multiple times and they weren't up against a wall and you knocked them back, they might actually go sliding in decent ways, and then you have to spend more action points to actually walk back up to them, and either you might not be able to hit them again, or if you hit them again, it might take the rest of your action points. So that one was a little bit iffy. It could be really strong if you were getting swarmed by other melee enemies, though, because you could just knock them back one at a time, and then they'd have to come back to you, and that would waste some of their action points. The Ripper was more likely what you were going to be picking for an endgame melee weapon, though, because it did pretty high damage. Not quite as high damage as the Super Sledge, although it was very comparable, and it also had the ability to ignore 80% of armor. So that was pretty strong. Just being able to rip right through your opponents is really good. There was a huge problem with this, though, and that is that the Ripper is never going to be as good as the Power Fist. If you're building like both a melee and an unarmed character, there's no reason for you to go with the Ripper over the Power Fist, because they're almost the same in damage. The Ripper technically does do a little bit more, but both of them ignore 80% of armor, and the Power Fist requires 1 less action point to use. And that's a huge difference, because the Power Fist starts out taking 3 action points to swing. If you get Fast Shot, that goes down to 2, because in Fallout 1 it was bugged, and then if you take the bonus hand-to-hand attacks level 6, it drops it to 1, so you just got to use 1 action point. The Ripper uses 4. So, 3 to 4, that's not that big of a difference. Maybe you can squeeze out another hit, but the difference between 1 and 2 is really big. That's 100% more action points you have to put towards an attack as opposed to the Power Fist, which is doing basically the same amount of damage and also has all the bonuses that the Ripper does. It might do slightly less damage or slightly less maximum damage, but that's going to be pretty neglectable when you get double the amount of hits out of it. So, like, the Power Fist is basically always going to be the better version, and unarmed is going to be better than melee. That's not to say melee is terrible, though. If you're going to go with a melee build, it's still going to work just fine. It's still very strong, just not as crazy as unarmed got. Moving into Fallout 2, melee would still sort of be in the same spot. However, melee did get better in Fallout 2, specifically at the start, because at the very start of Fallout 2, when you're in the Temple of Trials, you really only have a few different like attack styles. You have melee because you start out with your spear, which is really good. You have unarmed with your bare hands, or you have throwing also with your spear. And that's really the only way you can fight in there. And like starting out with the spear is really good. In like Fallout 1, that was more of like a mid-game weapon, and getting it right away is fantastic. On top of that, you can actually upgrade your spear inside of your tribal village at the start of Fallout 2, where you can get the sharp spear. So long as you go around and collect things for your aunt, I believe it was 3 healing powder that you needed, she would give you some flint, and then you go talk to another tribal guy there, and he would sharpen it for you, upping the overall damage. So it would go from 3 to 10 to 4 to 12. That's probably like the best weapon at the early game of Fallout 2. It is really nice. As you would go forward, you would probably just keep using the spear up through the mid game, and you likely wouldn't even switch it out until you got to like the late game, with the exception of maybe the combat knife because it's more action point efficient. So if enemies got close, you might stab them with that, and it's still comparable damage. It doesn't do as much as the spear, but still not bad. And then you would probably go to the late game weapons, which were the Ripper, the Super Sledge, and now the Super Cattle Prod. So the Ripper and the Super Sledge didn't really change, although you can get a Super Sledge guaranteed if you run and do like the Navarro skip, where you can get power armor and a Super Sledge, and if you do that right away, you have a really easy early game, especially if you're specializing in melee weapons. Like, it got way better because of that, and you could also pick up some perks that were really useful for this too. There was also like the bonus hand-to-hand dodging that you could do, which would be useful if you're building for both melee and unarmed. That was a really nice bonus, so that was a fantastic perk to be added to Fallout 2. The Super Sledge still kind of ran into the same issues of knocking enemies back, but it was very powerful, and that's actually really useful in the early game when pretty much all you're fighting is melee enemies. There's not a whole lot of ranged enemies. The Ripper was still good because it still ignored like 80% of armor. The Ripper in these games also used the small energy cells. It actually took ammo. Same thing with the Power Fist in the older games. So you kind of had to worry about that, but usually you had tons of ammo for that, so that wasn't that big of a deal. But now you potentially had a better endgame weapon with the Super Cattle Prod. The Super Cattle Prod actually did more damage than the Ripper per hit. It didn't have the 80% armor ignore, although it had the weapon accurate ability, so it was more likely to hit, which is pretty good. It also counted for electrical damage, which was very, very useful in Fallout 2 because almost nothing had resistance towards electricity. So if you wanted to hit something with this, you could actually do a lot of damage, and it was really good against power armor enemies, which is generally what you're going to be fighting at the end of Fallout 2 when you got to fight your way through all the Enclave. So that was probably going to be your endgame weapon. Was this still as like overpowered as unarmed was? I think it's more debatable here in Fallout 2 than it was in Fallout 1, where in Fallout 1 it was just objectively weaker than unarmed was. In this, I think you can make a real argument because the Mega Power Fist still ignores so much armor, as well as you have the different unarmed techniques that you can learn in Fallout 2. And you have pretty much the same amount of perks that go towards both of them that are very good. Like if you can get Slayer with them and Ninja with them, you're set up really well. It's just those are endgame perks as well in Fallout 2. So, like, it was still very powerful, and I think it was on pretty even footing with unarmed overall. Into Fallout Tactics, melee would pretty much go back to where it was in Fallout 1, sadly. So, melee and unarmed are still basically the same thing in Fallout Tactics. There's not that much of a difference, with the exception of some of them having a little bit longer reach, which is kind of useful if you're playing in real-time mode. Certain melee weapons like spears had longer reach than something like a knife would. Kind of makes sense there. The problem with a lot of the unarmed weapons in Fallout Tactics is that most of them are generally kind of useless because they get outclassed so easily at the start, where there's just a ton of different knives, machetes, like things like scalpels that you can use as weapons in Fallout Tactics, but they're all pretty much worse than like some of the other weapons that you can either start with or some of the other weapons you can get within the first couple levels. Like you can start out with the axe handle, and the axe handle is one of the best like melee weapons in the early game. It beats out almost all the other melee weapons that you can get within the first couple stages, mostly because you can just tag sneak and you already have it. And if you're going with melee or unarmed, you might want to be tagging sneak just so that you can use that. You can also have other characters spec'd with both melee and unarmed. This kind of runs into the same issue though, because pretty much the best melee weapon in Fallout Tactics is once again the Ripper. The Ripper's really strong. It still ignores a lot of armor. It's still very useful. There wasn't a Super Sledge in Fallout Tactics at all. There was a Micro Sledge, which was like a little one-handed one, but there was only like one of them, and it wasn't even really that great. So you're probably going to be using like the Ripper, or maybe the Cattle Prod, or maybe some of the other spears like the Diamond Spear or the Dynamite Spear. Like those ones you might use, but it was probably just going to end up being the Ripper. And once again, you have to compare the Ripper to the Power Fist. You get them pretty much at the same level, so you can go with either of them. But once again, the Ripper just costs an extra action point than the Power Fist does. So you might as well just use the Power Fist when it's doing pretty much the same amount of damage, when they all have the same bonuses as one another. You just get more hits faster with the Power Fist, so it's just going to be more useful in that regard. Into Fallout 3, we had Melee return once again. I'm pretty sure Melee's pretty much here to stay in all the Fallout games, but we had a whole bunch more choices in Fallout 3. And there was some real standout weapons in Fallout 3 that were actually really good for a melee or an unarmed build, or both. And there was more crossover, especially in perks, with both of those. So you're probably going to be maxing out both of them with a character that's built more like this. And, like, you could get some really good ones. There was plenty of bad ones you could get early on, like knives really weren't that great. But you could get, like, Chinese officer swords or, like, combat knives, which were pretty effective for fighting off most enemies. There was a lot more really good melee weapons that you could get later on into the game, like the Super Sledge was really powerful, did a lot of damage, and there was even more in the DLCs, where you could go to, like, Anchorage and get Jigwee's Shock Sword, which did just more damage than most of the swords and had electrical damage on it, so that was super nice. Also, you just had to complete the quest there, and then you would get it automatically, so that was a really good early game option. If you wanted to run up to the pit, there was multiple different auto axes that did really high damage, at least with one of them completely ignoring armor too, which was really strong. In the Mothership Zeta DLC, you could get the Samurai Sword, which was pretty powerful as well. And then even in the base game, it had some really good ones, like Jack, the Unique Ripper. That one could actually hit crits as opposed to the regular Ripper, which could not. So that made it actually really powerful and did a lot of DPS. And you could also make the Shish Kebab, which was arguably the strongest melee weapon in Fallout 3. Mostly because it got a benefit from the Pyromaniac perk. It was one of the few weapons that actually got a benefit from that, and it already had pretty high base damage with a pretty decent crit modifier. You couldn't get as high crits with this weapon as you could the Deathclaw Gauntlet, which was probably going to be like the best unarmed or melee weapon. I think the Deathclaw Gauntlet is probably the best of those ones. But this one was still very comparable, and same with like the auto axes were very comparable too, because like the man opener completely ignores armor, and that could be better against certain enemies as well as it attacks so quickly. It's just very heavy. So you had a lot of choices here, and it was actually rivaling like unarmed now, which was good. You had more choices with this than you did with unarmed. I think unarmed had like 6 weapons in total in Fallout 3, whereas melee weapons had like 30 or 40 options. And then we move over to Fallout New Vegas, where Fallout New Vegas was really, really good at making pretty much every fighting style overpowered. Like, there is definitely a reason to go with any sort of combat build that you want in New Vegas, and you're going to have a really good time, especially with all of the specialized perks that they can have. So once again, you are probably going to go with a mix of unarmed and melee, just because there's so much perk synergy there. But there was a real reason to pick either unarmed or melee, because there was so many great options here. And there wasn't like a huge difference, especially in like Fallout 3, because I didn't talk about the Iron Fist perk. That made it so unarmed was incredibly powerful in that early game, because like a base 15 more points to all of your unarmed weapons is kind of crazy. Melee didn't really have that option, and so many early game melee weapons were just flat out weaker than your bare fists were if you did it that way. In New Vegas, that's not really the case. You can actually run pretty much whatever you want, and there's perks that help out with everything. So with melee, you had plenty of options to pick from. You had pretty much all the same ones that were in Fallout 3, and some of them could be pretty useful early on. If you want some like generic melee weapons, you could pick up a shovel and Good Springs, which did good damage and had a surprisingly high crit chance. So that was good, as well as you could dig up the graves in the cemetery there, so you could potentially get some more loot. You could go with things like knives or like lead pipes. Lead pipes were actually pretty strong too, even though they broke pretty fast. They did do a lot of damage, especially for like early game. You could go and get Chance's knife right away, which was probably one of the best weapons in the game. One, because it weighs almost nothing, and that can actually be even lessened with certain perks, like Pack Rat can drop it in half, so it only weighs half a pound. And that weapon attacks really fast, does a lot of damage, has a high crit chance on it, has really high durability too, and it's affected by 2 damage perks where you can stack Cowboy and Grunt on top of it to just do tons of damage. There was great weapons in the DLCs where you could pick up like the Bowie Knife from Lonesome Road, or Blood Nap, which was insanely strong. That's arguably one of the best weapons. There was the Blade of the East and the Blade of the West that showed up in the game, and the Blade of the West was really powerful. The East is also powerful, but you don't get it until the very end of the game, so you're probably not going to use it. You had the Chainsaw, which got even better thanks to the Gunner's Arsenal DLC, because you could get a chainsaw with added parts to it and knock it down to the same weight as a Ripper, which was kind of crazy. Did even more damage and damage per second and completely ignored armor. You had big weapons like the Fire Axe and Knock Knock, which were fantastic for knocking down enemies. Knock Knock was especially difficult to find. I probably should have included that when I was going over like other difficult weapons in the Fallout games, because yeah, it is really easy to miss this one. You also had like the Proton Axe, which was just a better fire axe, since it did even more damage and also extra damage towards robots. The Shish Kebab had shown up here, and it was even more powerful than it was in Fallout 3. So, like, that's great. You had the Thermic Lance for stabbing enemies. You had a bunch of blunt weapons as well, like Ulysses' Old Glory, that you can knock down enemies with. You had, like, the big rebar clubs, or the super sledges. You could get Oh Baby, the unique super sledge, right away if you wanted to rush up there and get it. It is in kind of a scary spot to get to, but it was very powerful. Like, unarmed and melee both had really, really good options in New Vegas, and there was plenty of perks that helped out with these too. Like I said, Cowboy and Grunt helped out with Chance's Knife, as well as a couple other melee weapons. Super Slam was incredibly powerful, especially for two-handed melee weapons, because they have a 30% chance to knock down enemies on hit. That was really good. Jury rigging's also really good with these weapons too, because you can make it so like your super sledge that costs $9,000 or whatever, you can fix it with a $30 pool cue that you picked up off of a fiend. And suddenly you have so much more money because of that. You had things like Purifier as well to do extra damage towards certain enemy types. You had Pyromaniac to deal more damage with fire melee weapons like the Shish Kebab. You had a lot of really good options, and there was legitimate reasons to go with unarmed or melee, or really any combat style in New Vegas. All of them were very strong, and all of them could be really overpowered. Melee was in a fantastic spot there. And then we have melee in Fallout 4, and melee in Fallout 4 was also quite powerful. It could be extremely powerful if you wanted to run Blitz, and then use this pretty much just from VATS, because you can always engage on an enemy and just do a lot of damage. You could also potentially take like Pain Train and just run over enemies with power armor and then just stab them to death with weapons. And certain weapons here were actually really strong. This had a lot more weapons than unarmed. Unarmed I find to be pretty unsatisfying in Fallout 4. I also kind of find melee to be unsatisfying because of the blocking feature, where you can just stop basically all damage just from perfect parrying. And that's kind of annoying when enemies repeatedly do that, and you just don't get to attack a whole lot. VATS does help with that if you want to use it, and a melee build is quite strong. Like early on, you might just find things like machetes, but even machetes are fairly decent, especially the unique one with the Kramnus Tooth. Like, that one's pretty great because it has poison on it, and you can even take it off and put it on other machetes. So if you happen to get a legendary machete, you can put that blade on it and have poison on it as well. You could run and get Grognak's Axe, which was pretty good. It also had a chance to stagger on it. Most of the knives had chances to bleed, or you could put different blades on them to make them bleed. Pikmin's Blade was particularly strong since it did bonus sneak damage, which was really good. A lot of these weapons were pretty powerful throughout the mid-game. For endgame weapons in Fallout 4, the weapons you were probably going to be going with, I love taking the World Series bat, but that's more just as a meme to knock enemies away and send them flying. That's super fun. I would highly recommend that one. The Throat Slicer from Nuka World is arguably one of the best ones, though, since it does really high damage, it attacks fast, and it has extra bleed on it, which you can stack even more bleed. So you can kill enemies really fast thanks to that. Bleed is one of the strongest effects in the game. It's not as strong on like melee weapons as it is on fully automatic weapons, just because you can hit so much faster with them. And I would argue that like bleed full auto weapons are probably the most overpowered, besides maybe like Furious full auto weapons. Furious can be on melee weapons though too, where every hit you just do more damage, which is strong, but it's not as strong as like an AK with a drum mag hitting you. Like that's kind of crazy. You could also go with like the Shish Kebab for like an endgame weapon in Fallout 4. And there was also a couple Rippers that were really strong, particularly the Harvester, which you get at Far Harbor because it had stagger on it. And you basically just stun lock anything to death with it. You just hold it on an enemy and you don't even need to be spec'd in melee at all. It kind of just wins any fight in a one-on-one scenario regardless. Once again, melee would kind of fall into the same somewhat issue where there's just a whole bunch of weapons in this, or particularly melee weapons, that aren't necessarily as strong as other ones that you can get just super early on. That's less of an issue in Fallout 4 just because there's less weapons overall than there were in like New Vegas and Fallout 3, but still a little bit disappointing. Like it kind of sucks when they give you like so many options for melee weapons early on, but it's like, why am I going to take the tire iron when I have like the machete? Or why am I going to be taking like a board or a baton later on into the game? There's not really a reason to do it just because there's stronger weapons. And I don't think that's really a bad thing. It's just some of these weapons, like the board, you usually find a little bit later on into like the mid game when you're fighting super mutants. And it's like, even at this point, like, I probably have something better than that. I'm probably just not going to use it. So in conclusion, how strong have melee weapons been throughout the Fallout series? In Fallout 1, basically always weaker than unarmed, but still quite strong. Fallout 2, pretty much rivaling unarmed and very, very strong. In Fallout Tactics, kind of just weaker than unarmed overall, which is really disappointing. Fallout 3, generally weaker than unarmed, but still somewhat rivaling it. New Vegas, I think pretty even with it, and still a very, very powerful attack style. In Fallout 4, stronger than unarmed in this, and potentially one of the stronger builds in the game. I still don't think it's quite as strong as like guns, but that's just because legendary effects can make certain guns insane. So tell me your opinions on melee weapons. How good have they been for you throughout the Fallout games? Thank you guys so very much for watching this. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.